So you stumble, and instead of just owning it briefly and moving on, you make it the whole thing for a while. You apologize too much. You dwell on it. You keep bringing it up over and over. You write a really long, overly explanatory email. You're processing it out loud in front of your team. You are cratering. So, you're kind of pulling them into reassuring you that you're not a bad leader. Oh no, it's okay. We understand. You need that from them. So then what's started as a stumble has become a story, kind of an ongoing story that everyone wishes would end soon.
Welcome to You Might Try This, a podcast about learning how to lead without losing yourself along the way. Hosted by executive coaches Stacey and Cade Cowan. This show draws on 25 years of experience working with high-level leaders and brings those lessons down to earth. If you're navigating leadership for the first time, managing people, questioning old rules, and trying to build a career that actually feels good, you're in the right place. This is You Might Try This, honest leadership advice for ambitious people who still want to sleep at night.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome back to You Might Try This. This is the show for leaders who are, as we say, figuring it out in real time. I'm Cade, and of course, I've got Stacey with me, as I always do.
All right. Glad to be here. And, thinking about the place we ended up last week, Cade, was that most of what gives a leader real pull, right, that ability to influence over the course of their career, has very little to do with their title. It comes from the smaller, accumulated things, the trust that they build, the way they show up, the things they offer people that other people don't think to offer. And today we're picking up on the thing that more than almost anything else decides whether you keep that kind of trust or you burn through it, which is how you handle the day when you get something wrong.
We want to avoid those days, but inevitably they happen.
They do. And there's a piece of research I want to start with that I think nobody who's ever led anything should be allowed to not know, which is some research from 1990, excuse me. Mm-hmm. There were three researchers at Harvard Business School, Chris Hart, James Heskett, and Earl Sasser, who published a paper in the HBR called The Profitable Art of Service Recovery.
A wonky title, but a good article.
I know, The Profitable Art of Service Recovery. But what I love is what they were doing is they were studying customer service data across hundreds of companies, hotels, airlines, banks, restaurants. And they had a question that on its face was really quite simple, which was, what customers are most loyal? The ones who never had a problem with us or the ones who did? And the intuitive answer would be, well, the ones who never had a problem, right? They're happy, smooth experience, no friction, happy customer. That's kind of what back in 1990, every operations team in America was optimizing for. How do we never have a customer have a problem? But what's interesting about this study is that the data said the opposite. It said customers whose problem was well handled were more loyal than the customers who never had a problem at all. Meaningfully more loyal. It's what made a difference was the recovery itself. If it was done well, it built more trust than the absence of trouble ever could. And that finding has held up across decades of follow-on research. The phenomenon picked up a name in the literature called the service recovery paradox, right? So customers who experience a complaint that's well handled rate the company higher than customers who never had a complaint to handle.
Which kind of sounds backwards, doesn't it? And I would imagine back in the 90s when this research came out that people probably questioned, what's up with this data? Something must have gone wrong somewhere. But the finding's been replicated enough times now that we know that original data was correct. The why is the part that really took a while to come into real focus.
Mm-hmm. Well, and when you kind of play with it a little bit and you think about it, you sort of start to get why. When everything goes smoothly, you never really see the company or the product. You just see, the menu, the room, the website, but you don't see actually who there are as a group of people making decisions. But when something goes wrong, right? You finally see them. You see how they respond when there's nothing forcing them to do something. You see just like a person, what they're like under pressure. And what the data found is that the moment after the stumble, when it's handled well, was actually the company's best chance to tell the customer who they really were. It's kind of similar, Kate, just for a second, if you think about people and relationships. How much trust gets built when someone you care about fixes what went wrong versus never anything going wrong at all?
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're building on today. That dynamic that you've just discussed through this research, when you start applying it inside of a team, that same pattern seems to hold. The smooth weeks aren't really telling your team much about you. They see your work, they see the deliverables, but they don't really see what's this person that I'm working for? What are they actually like? It's the week that you stumbled that your team really gets the read on you. And the leaders that we tend to follow most loyally are often the ones who have stumbled in front of us. Those folks that are like, something otherworldly, who never make a mistake, who never stumble. They're not the ones that we really are willing to go to the mat for, so to speak.
No, they aren't. And so I like this question that we keep coming back to in this episode isn't whether you stumble, because as you said, Cade, we all stumble, we all make mistakes. As I once had a boss who I said to him, I'm so glad that you aren't perfect because I don't have to be perfect either, right? Right. He didn't really like that. But, right, the point is none of us are perfect and we all make mistakes, and you'll stumble, everyone does. That's just the reality of leading anything. The question is, what are you going to actually do in the 48 hours after you make a mistake? And the data from the Hart, Heskett, and Sasser research was, when you really look at it, suggests that those 48 hours could do more to build or break your team's trust in you than you had in any of the weeks that happened before it.
Yep. And so before we get into what good recovery actually looks like, let's spend a little bit of time on what leaders tend to do instead, because from what I've seen, if you can name what you're doing wrong, you're most of the way to being able to do something about it differently the next time. But there are two reflexes that you tend to see when a leader stumbles. And I've seen this almost in everyone that I've worked with. And most people will have a strong default to one or to the other. The first one, and I'd say perhaps the most common one, is the spin. Somebody stumbles and the first move is to start explaining it. You provide the context. You walk people through the constraints that you were operating under. You talk about the information that you didn't have at the time. You name the trade-offs that you were trying to make. And by the time that you're done, the stumble's been kind of converted into not really a stumble. You've basically justified your call. You told everyone it was the right call given what I knew at the time. But I think what most people hear in those circumstances isn't really what you said. They hear that you can't be trusted to tell them when you got something wrong, because almost everybody else is going to see it as a stumble. The fact that you're explaining it away, that's the part that ends up lingering. And I think that tells them more about who you are when something goes wrong than the stumble did itself. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think most of us are pretty good at smelling spin, even when it's done well. And most honestly, most spin isn't done well, right? The cost of being caught spinning, in my experience, is much higher than the cost of the stumble itself. It's not that you make a mistake. It's if you don't handle the mistake. So if you try to spin it, that's costly. The stumble was a one-time event, and the spin is starting to feel like a character read. The team starts building a story about who you are when something goes wrong, and the story they end up with is that this is somebody who handles being wrong by trying to make it being right. That's a hard story to come back from once it settles in.
So you've got the spin as the one reflex. And then the second reflex is really kind of the opposite of the spin. And you'll see this one a lot in newer leaders who care a lot about their team, which honestly, I think is a lot of the people that we'd be talking to who are taking the time to listen to this podcast. And this is kind of the crater. So you stumble, and instead of just owning it briefly and moving on, you make it the whole thing for a while. You apologize too much. You dwell on it. You keep bringing it up over and over. You write a really long, overly explanatory email. You're processing it out loud in front of your team. You are cratering. So, you're kind of pulling them into reassuring you that you're not a bad leader. Oh no, it's okay. We understand. Like, you need that from them. So then what's like started as a stumble has become a story, kind of an ongoing story that everyone wishes would end soon.
Well, and the cost of this one is also character read. It's just a different kind of character read, right? What ends up happening is your team is spending real energy managing your feelings about what happened. They aren't moving forward. They're not getting better. They're not solving an actual problem. They're being your emotional support system, which is exhausting for them in ways they can't always quite name. And it actually ends up making you look smaller in their eyes, not bigger, which I know feels backwards. Usually we think being open about hard things or taking accountability, or although it's not really taking accountability, but like kind of being vulnerable, right, is a good thing. But the version of openness that puts the team in caretaker mode, that doesn't read as strength to them. It reads as somebody who needs to be carried.
Yeah. And there's kind of a variation on this crater that isn't actually really a confession move. It's harder to name it because it sits somewhere in the middle. So the leader can't quite bring themselves to say the thing, but they can't really let go of it either. So they're kind of walking around like vaguely heavy, sighing in meetings, saying things like, well, we'll see how all this shakes out. And the team can like feel this heaviness, but they can't really name where it's coming from. So that's the other one, the one that's kind of lingering in the middle without a clear, definitive crater or a spin.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think both of these they come from the same place, right? So they're both about how the leader is feeling about being wrong. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's not just that they made a mistake. It's how they are feeling and processing their feeling about being wrong. And their feelings are what's running the show in both of those versions. Either the spin, if you break it down, is I can't tolerate being seen as wrong. And the crater is I can't tolerate being wrong at all. Mm-hmm. Either way, their discomfort with the stumble becomes the thing the team is having to organize itself around. And that's where the cost starts to add up. There's another move you were talking about, and the one we're going to spend the rest of this episode on today is the version of where the leader's discomfort isn't the thing the team is organizing around. Imagine that. What's organizing the room instead is what the team actually needs to be able to do next. So we're not focusing on how the leader feels about making a mistake. We're focusing on how does the team help the organization so the mistake doesn't happen again.
Beautiful. And the version of that move really has kind of like two beats, if you will. Number one, you own it briefly, and then specifically you start moving. So own it and move. I don't want them to sound that crisp because in my experience, like almost everyone who's trying to do this skips one of the two without realizing this, that the spin people kind of skip the own while the crater people are skipping the move.
Yep. Makes sense. So let's talk about that, Cade. Let's break down. Let's go into the what a good move looks like in practice. So we all make mistakes. We've talked about what can get in the way. Let's talk about what actually works. Because when we say own it, that phrase gets translated a lot of different ways. And most of them aren't actually what we're talking about as being useful.
Yeah, so let's kind of deconstruct that idea of owning it. Let's not be overly pithy about it. So if you break it down, you've kind of got three pieces. Like the first piece is just to name the actual thing. What was the decision that you made or the specific behavior? Not a vague version, not this I could have done better version. Just, what is the thing you did, not mistakes were made. That's kind of a classic spin sentence and people will recognize that right away. Mistakes were made. But like
by some ghost that isn't here.
Exactly.
In the room now.
Don't you love that passive voice? No subject in that sentence. But something like I decided to launch on the original timeline. I knew that this quality flag was still open. I made the call to launch anyway. Like that's a sentence somebody can actually do something with. So, and that's the same discipline that we were talking about in an earlier episode around the adjective ban. You can't own a stumble in adjectives like vague words, judgmental words, atmosphere words. Like you've got to own it in nouns and verbs, the specific call, the specific outcome. That's what makes it an own and not this vague mistakes were made apology.
Mistakes were made. I'm cracking about that. Well, and I always try to relate it back to in your own life when you think about when someone makes an apology that doesn't land. If someone in your life did something that bothered you and they said, mistakes were made, right? Are you going to feel
You're like, yeah,
better?
I know.
Like,
yeah, I know.
I know. And without well, which mistake are we talking about today? Without that specificity, Cade. So the way I frame it in coaching is whether if somebody who wasn't in the room could read your sentence or hear your sentence and know what actually happened, then you're doing this the way you should own it. If they couldn't, you're probably still hedging. And the vagueness is that hedge is kind of hiding and it could potentially be confusing people.
Yep. So that's your first one is like, use the sentence, nouns, verbs, state what happened. The second piece, and this one is, I think, the hardest, is to skip the explanation phase. So, if you find yourself starting a sentence with, now I want to be clear about why I made the call that I made, like stop there. Because typically what's about to come out of your mouth is spin coming in kind of through a side door. So people will sometimes ask you for context. And if they do, great, give that. But don't volunteer it as part of the owning it, because the moment the explanation starts, you've moved out of owning and you're back into explaining. And the thing that you want them to take from the moment, which was that you saw the stumble, ends up competing with this explanation. And the explanation is what they tend to remember. So skip the explanation. It's hard.
And it's so hard because explanations, we've talked about the fundamental attribution error, right? So we think of our actions being a result of our circumstances. So we want to explain our circumstances, but it lands as defensiveness for other people. Now, there is a version of this where the context actually really is important. So, for example, there are stumbles that happen for reasons the team generally needs to understand. But the way to handle that in my experience is really about sequencing. So own what happened first, pause, let the own actually land in the room, right? So here's what went wrong, pause. Then after the next breath, you can name the context as separate information, not as defense of the call. The order matters more than people think. If you start where you want to, which is, here are my circumstances, here's the context, therefore it's obvious that this mistake happened, it looks self-interested. If you acknowledge, I made a mistake, here are a couple things around that I'd like us all to be aware of so we can fix it going forward, lands in a completely different way. And almost nobody does the order right on the first try because it's not intuitive.
Yep. And then the third piece is to say what you're doing next. And again, here, specifics matter. This is not a vague, I'll do better, not let's regroup and we'll come back stronger. It's something more like, look, the call I'm making differently is before the next launch, that any quality flags have to be cleared by, random date, or we skip the launch. Like that's a sentence that somebody can actually invest some belief in. And, the reason that next step piece matters as much as it does is that without it, the team's got really nothing to attach their belief in you to. They've watched you do the first two pieces. They've heard the own and they've seen you skip the spin. Good on you. Now they've got to have something concrete to suggest that the next version of this situation is going to be different. The specific call you're making differently is what they're looking for. That's the own it and move,
Yep. Cade, I'm thinking about in an earlier episode where we talked about feedback and you talked about the difference between feedback and feed forward, and how just diagnosing what happened may be accurate, but it's not as useful for people, right? It becomes a kind of a judgment litigation of the past. And I think there's some connection here, which is getting people focused on you have to own it, but then getting focused on what are you going to do next is really what's powerful. What I would also add is there could be a lot of things to do next, but it's important to pick one thing and not 5. Not the lesson learned here are 10 bulleted list things we all need to do, but one specific call you're making differently. The list, in my experience, tends to allow spin to sneak back in through a different door. The one thing is what actually works because it focuses on the future and is perceived as accountability.
Yeah, as we said back there, you're kind of architecting the future now as opposed to judging the past. So those are your three pieces. You like name the actual thing, you skip the explanation, and then you say what you're doing differently next time. And this is the part where I think some people can fall apart. You actually move, like you go back to work. You don't keep coming back to the stumble. You don't process it in 3 different meetings over the next week. You just move. And what the team's going to remember about the moment is that it was clean, right? You had the clean own, not this agonizing, laborious, you bearing all of your feelings and insecurities about leadership. Just get on with it.
Move on. I think the hard part of this, Cade, for people sometimes, and maybe people listening will think about this a little bit or relate to it, is it's not the recent stumble that can be so difficult for people. It could be a bigger one that happened like 6 months ago that you never quite named. There's something about the process that you're describing that allows people some closure. And when you haven't done that, it can still be lingering for you or the team. And it's sitting there in the room and your team knows it happened. You know they know, but nobody's brought it up. So the real work sometimes isn't with the stumble in front of you. It's the one you're still carrying from the past. The same 3 pieces work, however, even 6 months later. So what's great about what you're saying is you can still do it. You can name the thing. You can skip the explanation, say what you're going to do differently now. And it's not too late, even if it's been a while. That often gives you as a leader, it kind of cleans it allows space for something new to happen because you're not carrying it anymore. I'll say honestly, it tends to feel a lot more vulnerable in the moment if you bring up a stumble from the past because you've been carrying the weight of it for longer than you needed to.
Right. There's like this cathartic release, I would imagine.
Exactly. And what that research we were talking about earlier from the Harvard Business Review article ends up telling us is that when you apply this concept to a leader instead of a company, it's the leaders who handle stumbles well. They end up with more trust on the other side than they had before the stumble. The trust premium from a well-handled situation or stumble is real. And in my experience, it's actually bigger than most people expect. The leaders who try to never stumble in the first place, who always play it safe, who hedge every call, who stay in the lane where nothing meaningful can go wrong, actually, they never get to build that kind of trust or followership. They're protecting themselves out of one of the strongest trust builders they have access to. The ones who make a mistake and own it, they have access to much more authentic and genuine followership.
Yeah. And Stacey, think about, in the world that we live in, where someone isn't making a mistake now and then, they're probably not playing for high enough stakes. This context that we're in requires risk-taking. It requires moving into areas that you are unsure of and incompetent inside of. We talk about experimentation all the time, right? The nature of an experiment is that you will get it wrong now and then. And so this is something that I think is part and parcel with leadership today. So Stacey, 3 experiments, as we always do. And, let's pick one. Let's not try to do all 3 in the same week.
Especially this week. Let's say pick one and let the other 2 wait. We're just going to do one. So the practice of doing one of these well is itself part of what we're talking about today. All right. So the first one, the one I want to give you is what I call the clean sentence. So pick a stumble. Could be recent, could be older than you maybe like to admit. Doesn't really matter for this experiment. What matters is that it's still in the room. Your team knows about it and you never quite fully named it and the thing is still sitting there. Write down one sentence that does the 3 pieces we've discussed. The specific call you made, the outcome, the specific thing you're doing differently now. No qualifiers, no qualifiers or context. I want you to make sure everyone, needs to understand everything around it. Just a simple sentence. Then read the sentence back to yourself. If it sounds defensive, you're not done yet. If it sounds like a confession, you're also not done yet. If it sounds like a clean piece of work, somebody reporting clearly on something they did and what they're going to do, that's the sentence.
Nouns and verbs, right? Nouns and verbs.
Nouns and verbs. Then say it to the person who most needs to hear it. Not in a meeting, not in an email, in a one-on-one or passing in the hallway. The setting should match the size of the stumble. If it's a small stumble, small setting. Big stumble, deliberate setting. But say it.
I love that the setting should match the size of the stumble. That's really interesting, and I think absolutely right. I've never considered that before. The thing I would add for anybody who's worried that they'll kind of mangle the delivery is that the delivery actually matters less than the fact of it. The fact that you said the sentence at all is what your people are going to remember. And so if you stumble a little bit while you're saying it, fine. Because sometimes like those imperfect moments end up reading more honestly, right? Rather than this really slick Willy type of rehearsed version. So
true. So true.
So the other one that I would think about is kind of like this 24-hour, this 24-hour move, if you will. Like this one is preventive. It's a rule that you kind of make for yourself going forward. So when you stumble, and I'm including small things here, not just the big ones, like within 24 hours, you name the stumble specifically to the person who was most affected by it. Could be one sentence in the hallway. Again, to your point, match the setting to the size of the stumble. Could be a single line in a Slack message. It could be the first thing you say at the start of your next one-on-one or even team meeting. It doesn't have to be this whole production. But what's behind that clock is that the own gets harder, with every hour that passes. So, at 24 hours, it's still this small, clean thing. At a week, it's something that you perhaps have to schedule a conversation around. At a month, it's something that you got to apologize for not having to have said anything earlier. So 24 hours is a really good limit to set for yourself.
I like that a lot. And the rule isn't, we don't want people to be neurotic about it. It's just not letting the small things build up and get heavy. Most of the stuck, owns, if you will, I see in coaching are things that should have been a 30-second hallway moment 6 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. They didn't happen, and now they need to happen. And they're going to need to be a whole conversation. It would have been so easy in that moment,
right? It would have been so easy.
And now the 24-hour version keeps the small things small. So if you do within 24 hours, it keeps it small. It doesn't allow it to balloon.
Mm-hmm.
So one more experiment, Cade, the one I want to put on your list is going first, which is in a team meeting this week, not a special meeting, just one of the regular ones you'd be having anyway. Name something on your end that didn't go well before anybody else has to. So it doesn't have to be a stumble in the strict sense. It could be a call you're not sure you made right, a project you're not happy with how it's going, a piece of work where you're aware you've been holding back from naming something maybe. Anything where you're modeling out loud in the room that you can hold something that didn't go perfectly and not flinch in front of the team. You're not getting defensive. You're not asking them to take care of you. You're just owning it. And this would connect to what we were talking about way back in episode 14, when leaders model that they can hold something hard without making the whole story or the team, it allows them to be able to do that too. So you're role modeling, if you will. But whatever you model in the room, the team learns now it's okay for them to do. And whatever you don't model in some quiet way, they end up learning is forbidden and not allowed, even if you never said anything about it directly. So the version of this that I want anybody listening to actually try is go first, not because you've decided to be vulnerable for its own sake, but because you've decided to be useful. Going first when it's mostly about you, the leader, needing to process is closer to the crater move, honestly. Going first because you can see that the team is waiting for somebody to make it okay, to be honest about what's hard. That's the version that actually does the work we're talking about.
Yeah. And this also, the other thing is it relates to what we were saying around psychological safety. The best teams are the ones that own the mistakes. You're also contributing to psychological safety when you go first and you're establishing, it's comfortable here to talk about these things. I'm doing it myself.
That's right. That's right.
I love these 3 experiments. I think that they're one, because we're all going to stumble. And so we need some tools in our arsenal. And these are just so they're so time bound and so discreet. You'll know if you said the sentence, you'll know if you did it within 24 hours, and you'll know if you went first. These are pretty easy to know, did I do this right? So I really like it.
That's right. And to your point, you don't have to do it perfectly. Just try it. Mm-hmm. So, Cade, next week, we're going to do something a little different. We've been talking the last couple of episodes about pieces of leadership that when you put them together, they point to something bigger, which is, important. What we want to talk about next week is about how do leaders track what's actually happening in the world? Mm-hmm. Right? Because you don't have to be the smartest person in the room to do that, but it's one of the most important parts of leadership. So the leaders who are tracking what's going on outside the company tend to be the ones who learn the fastest. Yes. And next week, we've got our one of our guests, Pascal Finette. He was a futurist and author of the book Outlearn, because he's going to make the case for what learning speed is and how you actually build it as a leader. So next week, we're going to talk about the learning advantage.
Yes, and Pascal is fantastic, and I think everybody's going to really enjoy that. So I'll see you then, Stacey. Thank you for today.
Love it. See you then.
All right, take care.
Thank you for listening to You Might Try This, brought to you by EDC and Edgewise Media. To learn more about the podcast, visit youmightTryThis.com or connect with us on social media.